thank you very much for your time this evening. I've got the shadow portfolios of planning, infrastructure, urban services, transport and heritage, which happen to be a pretty perfect fit for community councils. And especially I think for the North Canberra Community Council, given some of the issues that you're dealing with at the moment. What I thought I'd do this evening is just run through planning and transport very quickly with a few observations that I have with regard to some of the issues in that space. I'll of course discuss light rail and a few observations I have about that. But then perhaps more importantly, I'll wrap up as quickly as possible and then allow time for questions afterwards, which is probably going to get to the more pertinent subjects faster. So with regard to the planning system at present, on the whole, we firmly feel that it's just too complex at the moment. It's so complex, in fact, that actually I feel sorry for people at ACTWA, because to actually adjudicate on a DA or a territory plan issue is so complex. And understandably, I think they get it wrong every now and again. But I also acknowledge the difficulty it is for lay people to get across the territory plan as well. And so what it means is all the power is in effect in the hands of the professionals in this space. Because it's so complex and because it is, in a way, so inaccessible, it means that it lends itself to consultants and to the highly organised people in this space. And it simply shouldn't be that way. Whether you're a neighbour objecting or having concerns about something, or an owner wondering what the capacity or the potential is of your block, at present, I just don't think there's any clarity. There's of course huge issues with consultation and with sham consultation, and I think the overreach of the LDA is something which I hear of a lot. It seems to me that the LDA is pretty much the linchpin for anything and everything in Canberra at the moment. The territory plan is over 2,500 pages. I've actually got a printed copy on my windowsill to remind me of that very issue. It's got circular references, it's extremely complex, it is in effect inaccessible. And I don't think any legislation should be inaccessible, especially not something such as planning, which is meant to be something which everybody can get involved in one capacity or another. Now, some of the serious consultation issues that we've seen of late, of course there are a few at this side of town, including Dixon and Downer issues. The Yarralong Brickworks, I think, is a classic example. But then, of course, there is the entrenched, or the attempt to entrench poor consultation through the Project Facilitation Bill, the UC Facilitation Bill, and also the Light Rail Facilitation Bill. And what those three pieces of legislation have done, or have sought to do, is to limit consultation and limit community input. And that's certainly not what the system is meant to promote. With regard to some of the specific reforms that I think are required, the LDA, I think, has gone way beyond its responsibility. The LDA has turned into this organisation which has its tentacles in almost everything the government does, whether it's land release, whether it's the construction of or the provision of parking, whether it's a master planning, or indeed things such as the pop-up village by the lake. This is not an organisation that is highly tuned to the issues of land and land supply. It's an organisation which is totally dependent upon high yield and doing anything they can to get high yield. And this was most stark when they released the Lawson blocks, suburb of Lawson, about a year and a half ago, and they said it was a great success because they got between $400,000 and $800,000 for each block. And that to me is a failure. If anything, the government developer should be releasing land at the lower end of the market, and the private developers should be doing the other end of the market if you're going to have a disparity at all. So I think this obsession with getting yield from land release is causing all sorts of issues. And it's also causing issues with regard to the lease variation charge. Now, the lease variation charge is, of course, meant to be a tax on developers making a windfall. But what it has done is, in effect, stopped a lot of densification in certain places, which is counter to what the government's objectives supposedly are about infill. And that's why I firmly believe that the lease variation charge is actually in part an instrument to drive greenfields development, which is in effect the Land Development Authority space. So there's a lot that has to happen in the LTA and land release space. With regard to the city itself, the actual civic, I think there is a huge amount that needs to happen, especially around City Walk and Garima Place. The city's being stretched in every direction at the moment. Braddon is, of course, coming on very well. You have City West, you have Acton, you now have the redevelopment of the ABC flats, and you've got this supposed city to the lake development. So you've got the city getting drawn to the north, to the south, to the east and the west. And to that end, it's no surprise that in a city of 380,000 people, with a city centre and town centres, and you have that kind of draws on the city centre, it's no surprise that City Walk in Garima Place is not the bustling place that it should be. I firmly believe that we should have higher density in the town centre, especially in the town centres, and in group centres. And I think if that happens, you actually take the pressure off the suburbs. You take the pressure off having higher densities in the suburbs. And quite frankly, I think that the town centres, especially in the city, and to a lesser extent the group centres, is where we should have people living. That's where there is access to retail, to social and commercial services. So it's an obvious place to do it. However, the lease variation charge, I think, is stymieing a lot of that at the moment. The issue of heritage, I think, is massive and absolutely needs reform. If something gets heritage listed, I don't think anybody actually knows what that means. Does it mean you can knock it down? Does it mean that it gets ring-fenced? And what does it actually mean? And so I think there's a lot of examples elsewhere in the world whereby there are clear definitions of what heritage listing means, and that's taken into consideration from the very beginning. And just whipping through this, going into to transport. The opposition has already announced our commitment to add an additional 50 buses to the network. We believe that we should be expanding on the express and non-stop services around the ACT, and we should be giving bus priority where we can to help improve reliability, but also in transit times. We also firmly believe in the establishment or the expansion of separated or segregated bike paths. In particular, I believe the ones on Northbourne Avenue are dangerous, and that is a prime area that we're targeting for an improvement, which you'll be hearing from us in the coming months about. We believe there's obviously quite a few dot points there that don't require too much further explanation. The light synchronisation of intelligent transport systems is certainly something that we're exploring at the moment. But also the electric vehicle space, the semi-autonomous vehicles and autonomous vehicles, is something which I think is very conducive to Canberra's environment. I think semi-autonomous vehicles, in effect, where live and real-time traffic information is fed into vehicles to make them faster, to optimise routes, and to avoid accidents, is something which we can and should be doing right now. So therefore, you don't actually need to go and build more roads if you can actually optimise your existing road space in a much better way. It's also very important for planning public transport as well. And also, I've put down at the bottom there a fair playing field for taxi operators and taxi owners. There's of course a lot of talk at the moment about Uber coming into Canberra. Uber's pitch is that they're a separate industry to taxis. In effect, their ride-sharing business is a separate business, or a separate business model and separate industry to that of taxis. I'm not convinced by that, and I think if we're going to allow Uber to come into Canberra, then I think we certainly have to recognise the huge expense that taxi operators and taxi owners have invested into their plates and into their vehicles. Going forward, the inner north, I believe, should be, of course, a prime target for active transport, in particular cycling and walking. However, there really has been very little by way of cycling infrastructure or pedestrian infrastructure put into the inner north, aside from the city loop and some on-road cycling. So I think especially on the eastern side of Northbourne Avenue, of course where we are now, I think there is some scope, maximising some space around Limestone and going through Bradford. But I think that should be a key target with regard to our transport planning. Now, Capital Metro. I'm sure many of you are across the proposal. Gungahlin to the city, 13 stops, including a terminus at either end, with a depot in Mitchell, $783 million construction cost, approximately $23 million per year to operate. There's likely to be a dozen trams. They're projecting 3,946 peak hour users. However, at present, the buses are carrying 3,500 on the same route. Travel time is expected to be 25 minutes, and the construction is due to finish in either 2019 or 2020. Now, comparing the current buses to the proposed light rail, between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. from Gungahlin, with a dozen trams, that gives you 30 services. None are, of course, non-stop. The tram can't overtake the tram in front. Of course, you've got three suburbs in Gungahlin, serviced by the tram, with a 25-minute journey time. In contrast, at present, there are 74 buses from Gungahlin to the city. 4 of them are non-stop. You've got 10 suburbs in Gungahlin, serviced by a direct bus into the city, which then goes on to Russell and Barton, and they take between 20 and 25 minutes. So in terms of this being a transport solution for Gungahlin, someone in Amaroo or Ngunnawal or Nichols, Casey, Forward, Bonner, etc. can get one bus to Barton. Under light rail, this is their proposed journey. A bus to Gungahlin, a tram to the city, and then a bus to Barton. Now that, to me, is actually going to lead to a decrease in public transport usage in Gungahlin, and not an increase. And I think this is a very real issue that the government has not addressed. And it's all very well to say, well, these are going to be seamless transfers, but the fact is, all the evidence shows that, especially after at 2 or more transfers, the patronage goes through the city. However, it's debatable about one transfer, whether that can work, but I firmly believe that if people can get a faster door-to-door journey on a bus, they'd happily take that. In terms of the environment, it's proposed to be the most expensive project ever undertaken by an ACT government. It's about $5,000 per household to construct the Gungahlin to the city leg, and that's in the context of this year's deficit of $597 million and a $5.6 billion debt. Now, one of the concerns that we've had is that too few people live within walking distance of a train stop. So if you're looking at the 400-metre arc, you've got just 3% of Canberra's population, or even in Gungahlin, it's just 7% of Gungahlin's population. So 93% of Gungahlin's population, me included, cannot walk to a tram stop reasonably by their own definition of what of what public transport utilisation is meant to be. Now, to put this in perspective, what I've got here is the capital metro's stop design and their route in the inner north. Now, to make it clear, if you bring in the urban area where people are living, it's that blue shaded area. The 400 metre is that. So as you can see, there is a huge number of people, huge number of households in the inner north that are not going to be serviced by the 400 metre walking distance of light rail. Now, even if you take the government's line that people are willing to walk double the distance for a tram as they are for a bus, you get to that. Now, that is better, but it's still not doing much for many, many people. You're really only getting to a few streets, a few parallel streets into the inner north. However, this, of course, also factors into the mix people who live in the city and people who live in Braddon, people who live in Turner and the ANU. And the reality is, if you're living in Braddon, you're not using the tram a great deal to get to the city. So if you actually take away those people, you then get to this. And this is the inner north alone. In Gungahlin, it's even more stark. Which takes us to buses. In 2012, the ACT government made a bid to Infrastructure Australia, and the BCR, the benefit cost ratio, the total return on expenditure was going to be $2.34, and buses were going to be $4.78. That was based on $614 million. Now, the BCR for light rail has gone down to $1.20. Not $2.34, but $1.20. So what did Infrastructure Australia say in 2012? Incidentally, it was a Labor government then. The case for favouring light rail over bus rapid transit has not been strongly made, especially when the submission itself points to the stronger economic performance of a bus rapid transit option. The Productivity Commission also bought into it. The Productivity Commission said, in summary, a cost-benefit analysis showed BRT, bus rapid transit, to be a greatly superior option than light rail. That a less reliable form of analysis, based on less up-to-date information, showed light rail to be slightly superior, would not appear to provide a sound basis for overlooking this and deciding to proceed with light rail. One of the other issues that we've got with light rail is that the reality is that there was no genuine staging assessment done. When designing a mass transit system, the staging is extremely important in terms of what leg do you do first, and that way, if you get the best route first, it then feeds into the success of the second, feeds into the success of the third, and so on. So, unfortunately, Gungahlin to the city was just chosen because that's just a political imperative. Now, we actually posed a question of whether this route was ever considered. Now, I'm not saying it stacks up as a route, but we said if a tram went from Belconnen, past the University of Canberra, past the stadium, past CIT Bruce, Calvary's, ANU, the city, Convention Centre, CIT, Russell and the airport, was that considered? You'd have 2 universities, 2 TAFEs, a city, and hubs throughout. It wasn't considered. Now, I'm not saying this stacks up. I'm not saying this is engineering, is even possible from an engineering point of view. But it simply wasn't considered. So we would say that it's flawed from so many different perspectives. And finally, actually not quite finally, the second last slide is with regard to the trees down Northbourne Avenue. There are 860 trees which will be removed down Northbourne Avenue, and despite what they say, the vast majority of those are in good health. That's exactly what the that's what the EIS says, and that's what the arborist has said as well. Finally, this chart is a chart of population density of places that have installed light rail, or constructed light rail, in the last 25 to 30 years. Well, since the 1980s. Canberra's down here in terms of population density, and of course at the other end you've got Grenoble. We're at just over 400 per square kilometre, and Grenoble is up near 9,000. Now, look, this is not a precise science, so I don't want to put too much stock into it. Other than to say, it's all very well for other places with smaller populations to have light rail, but the comparisons have to be accurate, and the population density is the all-important aspect of the success of the public transport system. And unfortunately, here in Canberra, we simply do not have the density at this stage to really make this a goer. And that's why the government's own projections, so 3,900 people are using it in the morning, when buses are currently carrying 3,500. To me, it's a lot of money to spend for just 400 more additional public transport users, and there is a huge opportunity cost of what else you could do with $1 billion if you had that in your back pocket. So, that concludes my presentation. Thanks.
Open it up to questions. Rebecca?
If the government, the Labor government, sign a contract around about April of next year, and if you win the election, will you cancel the contract?
Yes, we have said we would. Every contract has a terminate for convenience clause in it. Government contracts do. We would seek to exercise that terminate for convenience clause if it's reasonable.
Is that in the tender document?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily.
Public, aren't they? The tender's public?
Well, the contracts are public. However, they may well black out certain sections as being commercial in confidence. So,
isn't it in the tender document?
no, I doubt it will be.
No, the contract, when they let the contract, when they called for tenders, didn't they have a draft contract?
No.
They didn't say anything.
No, they haven't.
Okay.
Yeah, certainly haven't been published, that's for sure.
Get in the corner.
Can I just clarify the point that you made about the expectation of passengers on light rail? On one of the slides you gave a figure that showed the number of people who were expected to use buses, I think. And then you showed the projected figure for people using the light rail, and there's an increase of about 400 people.
That's right.
But what would happen to the buses that aren't then being used to carry the people?
Well, the government has said that buses won't run down Northpoint Avenue, and you won't be able to get a bus from Gungahlin to the city. So the buses will turn into feeder services. And in actual fact, that's of particular relevance for people in the north. As
So there'll be no buses at all down Northpoint Avenue?
That's what the government said.
Okay.
And further to that, it means that people in Hackett, for instance, will actually shuttle into Dixon to get onto the tram. So it's, at this stage, it seems like people in Hackett in particular, and also Watson, will not have direct bus services to the city. They'll be in a situation where they're forced to transfer.
If I can go back to what you were talking about, the LDA, and you said something along the lines that the laudable aim of saying the LDA should be going in at the lower end of the market. Did I understand you to say about the private developer that they're allowed to make rip-off profits?
No, I didn't say that. But what I said is that if anything, the LDA should be doing providing for affordable housing.
Yeah.
If anything,
which the government used to do years ago.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's a very laudable aim. The private developer is allowed to.
Well, the private developer, like the LDA, if the LDA is going to be in this space, as is the private developers, then they should all have an obligation and responsibility to provide a variety of stock for a variety of incomes. But at present, land prices in Canberra are astronomical. And unfortunately, you look at this development over in Tralee, which is going to be mostly affordable housing. I firmly believe that development should be in Canberra. And I believe if in 5 years' time you knock on doors in Tralee and say, would you rather live here or in the same house in the ACT? I believe the vast majority of people would prefer to live in the ACT. And if they're going to use our hospitals, they're going to use our schools, they're going to use our roads, well, why not collect the rates and GST revenue as well? So I believe that is a tremendous market failure to not have affordable housing here in Canberra, and the LDA, as the supplier and the regulator, is responsible for that.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'd like to address trip times and their impact. The government claims trip times from Garland to Civic of about 25 minutes. Peak hour, well, frankly, that's garbage because it still is on the ground and it still has to go through all the intersections. Now, if that realistically goes out to 35 minutes, say, what does that do to their cost-benefit analysis? I suspect it makes a pig's ear of it. Have you crunched those numbers? And secondly, have you looked at alternative transport systems, not buses and not trams, but ones that are seriously faster and seriously cheaper? And I've done some number crunching on one option. If it were expanded through all of Canberra, it would return about $1.2 billion a year in terms of productivity gain for quick trip times.
What sort of transport?
Sorry?
If it's not a bus and it's not a tram?
Overhead, so that you're above the traffic, you don't slow down for intersections, and you don't have any interchanges, you go straight to where you want to be. The detail doesn't matter too much, but the trip time does. And have you looked at alternatives other than buses and trams?
Yeah, look, we certainly have. Not to a point whereby we're able to conclude that they are a better way forward than reasonable investments in bus infrastructure. But the issue you raise, the core issue of a train at grade that comes across the same intersections is going to have serious problems.
Absolutely.
There's no doubt about that. And in addition to that, the government's going to have this incentive to put as much density as possible on the route to try and capture some of this benefit of having a tram. And of course, the more density you put on the route, the more stops you put on the route, the worse it becomes for people in Gungahlin. So it actually goes from being a transport solution for Gungahlin to simply being a value capture, primarily in the inner north. And to that end, I think that the government's claims that this is going to be a silver bullet for transporting Gungahlin is foolish. It simply will not eventuate. And as I said earlier, the vast majority of people in Gungahlin are not going to be within walking distance and are still going to be dependent upon another mode of transport.
A lot of the problems that are sort of raised by the government is that, okay, in Canberra depend very much on land sales, real estate in one form or another, be it commercial or private real estate, to gain revenue. So pumping that whole area as hard as they can to get the revenue to run the city. And it seems to me that if you can't keep even going that long in the medium term, let alone long term. And it is a problem right now, one would admit that. And I would suggest that if you were in government too, you'd have that same problem. You can't prune back too far where you get the revenue from, and that's the question I'm asking. In order to take a lot of pressure off the, this area of land and real estate as being the main source of income, then one would need policies and, you know, really thought through just how Canberra, should start sort of generating revenue other than just through land sales and houses and lease changes and all that sort of thing. Have you got, your government's got some plan to maybe sort of start moving in the direction of trying to get Canberra to generate more income? There's one major problem. One of the sources of income in other cities would be from corporations and that. Well, we've got a federal government, they don't pay much. But they don't pay anything yet. But it seems to me like in my experience of reading of cities in America that have something like 4 universities, we've got 2 major ones, which is mine one. There's all these spin-off industries start, being set up, and actually Canberra's quite weak in that area, and that's one possibility as I see. But do you have any other plans for growing Canberra to the point where you can be less dependent for revenues on the current system?
Yeah, well, it's of course two-pronged. One is of course the revenue, and the other is the expenditure. Now the expenditure, for example, it's very hard for the government to go to the Commonwealth government and say we're broke and we need money for Mr. Fluffy, when on the other hand they're spending $1 billion on a tram. And I think they have undermined themselves through this process. This $783 million project is primarily going to be financed through the private sector. So the finance rates are considerably higher than if it was a government-funded project. So to that end, in addition to the operating costs, we expect it to cost about $100 million per year to finance and fund light rail, which is a huge amount of money, absolutely massive when you look at $100 million of recurrent, in effect recurrent. Some of it will be paying off the construction costs, but in effect, it's $100 million that has to be doled out each year for 20 or 30 years. So, if we start looking at issues like that, that incidentally is $700 per household per year to pay. So that, when you look at what your rates are, $700 would be a fair increase on those, and that's simply to pay for light rail, not health, not education, not other infrastructure, just light rail. Now the rates issue is of course relevant for this as well. We believe that the government's shift from stamp duty onto rates is unfair. Now, it's not to say that stamp duty is a perfect tax, don't get me wrong. However, slugging people more and more, especially when their income is not increasing, we think is just unfair, as simple as that. And that's why we will not support Labor's plan of rolling stamp duty into rates. Finally, with regard to private sector here in University, that is really where we're going to get a more viable income stream, if we can genuinely attract private sector here in Canberra. Now, we've got the fortune in the ACT of not having regional hospitals or regional schools and regional roads. They're often extremely expensive. We're a city-state that should be able to run, I think, fairly efficiently, especially compared to other jurisdictions. But in the health space, for instance, we're the least efficient in the country. So it just shouldn't be that way. So I think we should be able to manage our expenditure better, but in turn, if you do that, then you can do far more to make Canberra more conducive for investment. And affordable housing has to be in amongst that mix.
Hi. I'm a little curious. If I understood you correctly, you said earlier that if we build a light rail, if that does happen, and high densification occurs closer to the city, noteworthy in the north in Canberra, that will slow down the light rail. So I'm trying to sort of marry in my head how if you don't densify on a transport corridor, regardless of means of transport, you don't have enough people on it. And yet if you do densify, you slow it down, whether it's a bus or a tram, I imagine that would apply in a fairly similar way. That struck me as a bit self-defeating. I'm trying to understand your rationalisation.
Sure. The main issue is that light rail being at grade means that you can always put in more stops, and there's always good incentive to put in more stops, because the more stops you do, the more you can have hubs around it, the more you can sell land around it, etc. So there's always that temptation to add more stops with light rail. That simply doesn't happen to the same extent with heavy rail, for instance. And if you actually look at a density chart of a light rail route versus a heavy rail route, you get, with light rail, you get a very thin band of densification along the route, whereas with heavy rail, around the stations, you get this radiating density, a bit like a target, if you know what I mean. And therefore, it creates a real hub, because there are real benefits. Even if you're going the wrong direction, even if you're going counter to the direction of the train, it's justified because of the time you catch up with the actual transit time. Whereas with light rail, there's always going to be more pressure to put more people on the route and to make the stops more populous.
Would you see that happening on Northbourne?
Absolutely, absolutely. I've got no doubt whatsoever that the government will be under immense pressure to put in more stops.
Most cities' trams travel at about 11 kilometres an hour.
Melbourne's does,
Right? That's an hour from
Melbourne's
Gungahlin.
does 14 kilometres an hour, and I think the Gold Coast is at 22.
Yeah, there's a lot slower.
But they are slow. In contrast to buses, you can always have non-stop buses. It doesn't matter what happens on the route, you can always have non-stop buses. And to that end, you've always got this control, this lever, which you can use to impact on travel times.
Oh, it's the 4-lane tram track.
Non-stop
That's right.
trains. But we can have non-stop trains. Everywhere there's a station, there's a bypass that goes around. So as that one's programmed, there's one coming through just...
I don't think there'll be many
That's
places.
patented and copyright.
I don't think there'll be many places where there are at-grade trams that have bypass lanes.
There's not.
Okay, Leon?
The cost-benefit analysis that you showed before actually shows that bus rapid transit under the high-density scenario will generate total benefits of 1.3 billion, which is 90% of the benefits of light rail at less than half the cost. So if you're not going to build light rail, will you build bus rapid transit?
Good question. I like the idea of light rail. Everybody likes the concept of it. I like the idea of bus rapid transit as well. However, the reality is that if the government has not relocated the services down Northbourne Avenue and they haven't chopped down the trees down Northbourne Avenue, then I think it would be foolish to do so. So we do not have an intention to go through with that work if it's not done by the time of the next election. It's not to say that there's not scope for significant public transport improvements on Northbourne Avenue, especially on the curb side, but also with regard to cycle paths and pedestrian paths as well. So I think there is a lot that can be done curbside, but that's certainly something we're looking into in a lot of detail at the moment.
Alistair, in relation to the last government accounting year, and I'm afraid I don't know when that ends, whether it's...
It's a financial year.
Yeah.
It's a financial year.
How much was paid into the government coffers by the Land Development Authority, and what proportion was that for the year of the government revenue?
Look, I'm afraid I don't have that on me. I don't know. I'll have to get back to you on that, I'm sorry.
Okay, next.
Alistair, it's interesting information, and I've heard from the other side as well about light metro, or light rail, or whatever it is, and and you go to one of those and it's quite convincing. Come here, it's quite convincing. I hear the Productivity Commission, you failed to mention that part of their bit the other day was that part of them are advocating that Canberra needs to do something. At what point will the Assembly, who are our servants, come together for a joint solution? Because this will outlive you guys. And it's got to be for the whole of Canberra. Your poles apart, but you both want the same thing. And we want you to get the same thing. Maybe it's a mix of light rail, maybe 50 more buses on the road. I'm not convinced. Absolutely not. One iota. That 50 more buses will provide a solution. Maybe in the short term. The only thing I'll say about the light rail, they seem to have a longer vision of this. 50 buses, that's only now. What about when my kids are older? You know, but I do get it. The current rate, Mr. Barr will tax us out of living here. We'll not be able to afford to live in this town unless you are fully employed by the Commonwealth, probably. You just won't be able to do it. The rates are going up through the roof. When will the Assembly come together and come up with a joint solution that you both accept, irrespective of who wins, you go forward and do it? Maybe that is part of the solution. I don't know.
Well, I firmly hope that will happen after the next election. And we have said that the next election should decide this issue. We will have a very clear alternative on the table for both the inner north, but also the south side, and also Dog Common. So that there will be a alternative transport vision for people to consider at October next year. Now, if the Liberals win government, I hope that the Labor opposition would support what the people have done. In turn, if the Labor Party wins government again, then we would respect that as being a mandate to go ahead with light rail. But at this stage, I really don't believe the government has a mandate to go ahead with light rail. I do not believe people voted on the issue of light rail at the last election. Last election, they took a policy of $30 million for an engineering study to the election. It was not a $783 million proposal. So the best thing we can do, and I believe the responsible thing we can do, is have this discussion about light rail and buses and other modes of transport, to not sign contracts before the election, to put it on pause, and to allow the people of Canberra in October next year to have their say. I believe that's a responsible course of action, and I know the opposition will give a firm undertaking, and this is being recorded, a firm undertaking to respect the voters in October next year with whatever they choose.
Thank you. You earlier in your talk pointed out how complicated the territory plan and planning in Canberra is. I completely agree with it. It's very confusing and difficult. We were part of a resident association, and we really struggle with it. But if it's like, federal governments have been trying to get the tax act simplified for more than 20 years or even longer, and it's failed. How do you propose to, and what do you propose to do about making it easier?
Well, it's important to note that there have been several rewrites of the territory plan before, so it has been done.
Yeah, and it didn't make it easier.
I'm certainly not saying it made it easier, but it has been done. There is form, there are precedents for rewriting the territory plan and in effect resetting the situation. Unlike the Tax Act, which involves lots of vested interests, 2 houses of parliament, and many thousands of regulations and pages of legislation. We are a unicameral chamber, whereby at present 9 people can make or break any decision in the territory. After the next election, it will be 13. But we have real economies of decision making in the ACT. This sort of stuff should not be insurmountable. If we cannot make a simple planning system in the ACT, if that is too hard, then we may as well all give up. This sort of thing has to be achievable. It is achievable, and there are many councils around Australia that do exactly what we do here, albeit in a quarter of the number of pages, or even lower number. There are ways to make this a far simpler system. And part of it also is just technology. Part of it is actually making the document not just not just 70 PDFs on the planning website, but to actually, why don't we have an app whereby you can click on any block and it says exactly what you can and can't do, what are sample developments, and what are the relevant codes. These are the sorts of things that can be done right now. So we firmly believe that we should be empowering Canberrans by making a simpler planning system that more people can get involved with.
I got a million questions, but I better do one, I suppose.
They're all good.
With gentleman's question here about revenue, and most of our revenues from land tax and rates and stamp duty.
And Commonwealth grants.
And, well, yeah, that's not, well, okay, you call that one, but I think the governments have to get back to owning things. Every government is selling everything off, and then it's got to rely on something to get the money back. This government, and it's going to be the same when if you get in, you're going to have the same things to rely to get money from. One big issue I have with with rates and land tax is I own commercial properties, I'm a small business, and commercial blocks of land have 10% of the blocks of land in this town. Residential has 90%. There's no land tax on commercial anymore. It got jumped into general rates and they doubled them at least. But we pay 50% of the general rates for 10% of the land than what the residential does, which means small businesses getting hit like hell. And as the gentleman over here said, somewhere down the track, people are going to start moving out of this town because small business won't be able to survive. Okay. Now the other issue is extension of time fees and change of use charges. They're so astronomical. I got hit $235,000, right, to do an extension of time. I argued with the government for 2 years. I won't swear, but that guy that's now Chief Minister was a pain in the butt with the whole system, right? He's an AH, if anyone can work out what that is. But it took me 2 years to fight to get my money back, and the ACT government was at fault. Now, I'm saying to you is, look at the system for the general public to make life simple for them, to then, if there is an issue, to solve it quickly. I could have gone out of business, right? So the question for you basically is, what are you going to do to broaden the income for the ACT government? It's a similar question, but I don't think you really answered his question in looking at broader ways to earn money rather than rip everybody off in just general rates and stuff. The government doesn't do anything to earn that. They hit me $50,000 for a change of use charge. All they did was 2 pieces of paper. That's $25,000 for 2 bits of paper in 25 minutes of work.
Yeah, look, in terms of diversification of the economy and alternative income streams, that's going beyond my personal remit as a shadow, but also just in terms of this part of the cycle, we're very curious about next year's budget. I think the government's going to have to do we're going to have to make some very big decisions to rein in the deficit. Or the debt is just going to increase significantly. With regard to governments owning more things and running more, in effect, business ventures, look, I'll probably disagree with you there.
Where are you going to get your money from to diversify?
I don't think there are too many examples of where governments do that particularly well.
Well, why outsource and pay $500 to change a lot from government?
That's right.
When if you employ a carpenter and have an apprentice assistant, it can be done a lot cheaper.
Look, I'm not saying that every instance of outsourcing has been a roaring success.
Right,
I'm just saying as a principle, I think if the private sector is capable of doing it, then with appropriate contracts and appropriate management, we should be able to get a better deal out of it.
We don't see the appropriate contracts.
buildings.
Okay, look, I'm conscious of the time, everyone, and we have David Collette also waiting to present, and we're half hour out. I notice we have 2 questions here. Can you ask you, and then we'll see how we go. David.
Could I ask in the medium term whether we might see all 3 parties in the Assembly think about what an integrated transport system might look like in terms of buses and bicycles and trams and whatever else, taking into account the possibility that there might be routes through Queanbeyan, if there's a rail to go out to the airport. In other words, can everyone in the Assembly think about it as though they were all in the same town rather than in 2 separate camps?
Yeah, look, unfortunately we do have an adversarial system. That's just the nature of government, and quite frankly, that hopefully presents better decision making. And it's just as a court works with a defence and a prosecution, and you hopefully thrash it out to get the best outcome, that's in effect how the Parliament works as well. And it's by holding governments to account. And quite frankly, if we just rubber stamped this $1 billion project and just said, well, let's just do it, it's in the best interest of Canberrans, supposedly, well, you can rest assured it'd be more than $783 million right now, and it'd be going out a lot more so.
Queanbeyan and Belconnen, your proposal, I mean, can't you think a bit more widely than just the Gungahlin thing?
Well, sorry, I should state that it wasn't my proposal to do the other route. It's simply saying that we need to do as you said. There has to be a proper station plan. There has to be a genuine policy for this. It can't be ad hoc, whereby a month after the election, in order to get 9 votes on the Assembly floor, you do a deal with Shane Rattenbury to get into government. It can't be that way. It's got to be more substantial.
Okay, final question.
In terms of revenue, we really do have a problem, and none of the ACT governments have been prepared to tackle it. And essentially what happens in the states is that governments don't pay each other tax. The states forego 5 or 6% of their total revenue by not taxing the Commonwealth. We lose 50% of our revenue by not taxing the revenue. We are told that the Commonwealth Grants Commission compensates us for that. It simply does not, and the Commissioner has said it doesn't. It does compensate us for the use of our schools, hospitals, and that stuff. That's fine. But it doesn't carry its weight in terms of it uses the community, but it doesn't contribute. Now, this town is not viable unless and until you take them on and say, you are a parasite, you have to...
Is there a question coming up here?
Yeah, what are you going to do about it? When are you going to take the feds on?
Well, we will quite happily try and extract as much money as possible from the Commonwealth Government. So if you can... If those figures, I have not heard those figures before with regard to the Commonwealth impact on other jurisdictions versus here. That's pretty compelling, and I haven't heard that case made. And if you're able to provide the data backing that up, I think that sort of information is useful, and it's useful in the public discourse as well.
Yes, and the town's not viable without it.
On that note, everyone, let's thank Alistair for his time.